Hi, welcome back to Chapter Chat. The chapter today is number 5 and it is called Food in brackets, almost. Although Fred had drunk so much water and the skin on his stomach was stretched tight, he was still painfully hungry. His insides ached and growled noisily. Fred thumped his front with a fist. His body felt at half-mast, weak and flimsily built. He hadn't eaten anything since an apple before he boarded the aeroplane. He wasn't sure how long ago that was. A day and a half? He thought back. The flight had been on a Saturday, so today was probably, unless they'd all been unconscious for a long time, Sunday. Fred shivered. He shook his head, trying desperately to clear the picture of the burning plane from behind his eyes. "I think there are insects we can eat," he blurted, more to distract himself than anything else. The comment was greeted with a silence so unenthusiastic that it seemed to have its own particular smell. "And we can find fruit," he added. "There's got to be some. There are monkeys, and the monkeys have to be eating something. Bananas, maybe. There were banana leaves in the den, or berries." "How will we know if the berries are safe?" said Con. "I'll test them," said Fred. "What if you die?" asked Con. "Maybe we should all eat them if we find any," said Lila, "but not Max." "Why not?" said Con. "If we're risking our lives, why shouldn't he?" "Because he's too young," said Lila, "and he has allergies." "That's not fair," said Con. She smacked a small rock against a large one. Fred could feel his own temper slipping away. The heat was burning and his stomach felt bitter and tight. "Con," he said, "come on. You don't know me well enough to tell me to come on. Nobody voted you leader." Fred bit his tongue, feeling his nostrils flare angrily. "I didn't say I was." Lila's face was crumpling. "Don't," she swallowed and tried to change the subject. "What were you saying about insects?" "One of my books said you could eat the insects that eat cocoa pods." "What book?" "Just a book about explorers. It had been about Percy Fawcett, a man who had come to the Amazon in search of golden cities. It was the kind of book that left you breathless and eye-stretched." "What did your book," Con pronounced the word with distrust, "say the insects looked like?" "Small," said Fred. "It said not to eat any insect too big to put up your nostril." "Any further detail on that?" asked Con. Even her teeth looked sarcastic. "No." Fred wished, not for the first time, that more of his books had had pictures. "Lila will know," said Max proudly. "Lila knows all about animals. She nearly got expelled for trying to keep a squirrel in her desk." He grinned. "Mamma was so angry." "Shh, Max." Lila glared, embarrassed at her brother. "Well, insects aren't animals," said Con, "so none of this is useful." "Do you know?" Fred asked Lila. There was a spark of something stirring behind her eyes. "I'm not sure," said Lila, "but actually," she jumped to her feet. "Max, stay here. I'll be right back." "What? No!" Max put down the leaf he was chewing on and screwed his face into an angry ball. "Wait!" But Lila had gone, running out of the clearing, her half-burnt braids swinging behind her. The 15 minutes that followed were not peaceful. Max tried to follow Lila, but Lila had disappeared into the undergrowth and couldn't be found. Fred picked Max up to stop him from running out through the unmarked, thick, crowded trees. Max bit Fred on the back of his hand. Con called him a brat. Max bit Con on the shin. Before Con could bite Max back, Lila burst out of the trees. Her eyes were raw with relief. "Thank goodness! I thought I was lost. I missed a turn somewhere," she said, her breath jagged-edged. She had made her jersey into a kind of sack, held in both arms. Her forehead was shining with sweat. "Did you find food?" asked Con. "Yes," she said. Then her honesty got the better of her, and she added, "almost." She opened her improvised sack and poured dozens of pods onto the grass. "They don't all have lava holes in them," she said, "but I thought we could eat the cocoa beans too." She began breaking them open with her nails. Fred picked up one of the pods. There were 2 holes in the top. There's something in here. He tried to shake the something out, but it didn't come. He poked a stick into the hole and shook it again, and a fat little grub, an inch long, tipped out onto his palm. "That's it," said Lila. "That's the grub. You can eat it." "Oh, good," lied Fred. The grub lay on his hand. It didn't move, but seemed to be pulsating slightly. He sniffed it. "Go on," said Con. "It was your idea." "Ugh." Fred pinched his nose, braced himself, and bit the grub in half. It was soft, but its insides were sandy, and the crunch of it against his teeth made him shudder. He swallowed with difficulty. "It tastes a tiny bit like chocolate," he said. "Really?" said Con. Her whole face and even her ears were sceptical. It's difficult to make ears register emotion, but Con managed it. "But mostly like dirt," Fred admitted. "Peanuts and dirt." Soon the grubs lay in a pinkish, writhing pyramid. Fred tried to feel grateful that they had any food at all. He failed badly. Lila picked up 3 plumpest and offered them palm up to Max. "No, that's not food. Max only eats actual food. Mama says don't eat insects." Lila sighed. "He talks about himself as if he were another person when he's nervous." "Max isn't nervous," said Max. "Maxie is just being good." He began to hiccup. "I want to go home," he said. "I know you do," said Lila. She pulled him closer. "But this is all we have." "I don't know what else to do, Maxie." He pushed her away. "Mama would know." His nail caught on the cut on Lila's cheek. "But Mama's not here." She blinked hard and wiped her nose on her wrist. "What if we fried them," said Fred, "and made them into a pancake?" "Fry on what? We haven't got a pan," said Con. "But we've got stones," said Lila. She scrubbed her face with her top and tried to sound bright. "We could make chocolate pancakes." "Sort of." "Sort of," said Con. Really, quite amazingly, sort of. Okay, on to chapter 5. It's called Fire. The grubs, when mixed with the cocoa beans and pounded with a clean stick, turned into a paste which, if you squinted and were of an optimistic temperament, looked like flour and water. "Now we just make a fire and cook them," said Fred. "Just," said Con. "We need flint," said Fred. "And bits of kindling," said Lila. "And matches," said Con. "I'll do the kindling," said Fred. Most of the wood surrounding them had dried since the rain the night before. He held the hem of his shirt in his teeth and made a hammock for the wood. The night in the jungle had not improved the taste of the cloth. He tipped the wood into a pile a few paces away from the den. "There were flints in there," said Lila. "We could rub away the moss and use them to make a spark. Flints don't go off." "Flint isn't enough by itself," said Fred. "I've tried. You need a bit of steel." Lila ducked into the den to fetch the flint. Con was staring at Fred's watch. "What's that made of?" Fred stared down at the watch, covering it protectively with his hand. "Glass and steel," he said. "My father gave it to me when I went to boarding school." "But it's broken," said Con. "I know that." "So," said Con, "if it's broken, it's not really a watch anymore, is it?" "But what it is a lump of steel." Fred jerked his hand back. His father never bought him birthday gifts. He had left his secretary to take Fred to Harrods to pick out something sensible. This was the only gift Fred could remember his father choosing himself. He had had it engraved with Fred's initials. Lila smiled. Her voice had sympathy in it, but grit too. "It might be the only way," she said. "Fine," said Fred. He had an unaccountable, absurd need to cry. "Fine, we'll use it." "Can I have first try?" asked Con. "It's my watch." "I know, but I've never lit a fire before," she said. "Not even the ones in the fireplaces at home." "Not allowed." There was longing and hunger in her eyes. She looked away from him, turning the flints in her hands as if they were jewels. There was something written in her face, Fred thought, something in a code he couldn't begin to read. "Here." Slowly he undid the strap. He held the watch in his fist, surreptitiously tracing the letters on the back with his thumb. Con watched in silence. He put it in her palm. "I get second go." Lila heaped shredded leaves and dried grass in a pile. You do it over that, she said, so the spark has something to catch. Con struck the back of the watch against the stone. Fred winced. She overshot and dug the flint into her own skin. She said nothing, tried again. She bit down on her tongue, concentrating. Her eyebrows furrowed so deeply they nudged against her eyelashes. Suddenly, flint and steel let off a tiny spark. Con was so stunned she fumbled the flint. Again, shrieked Max, again, again. The spark came again, a brief flare into the world that vanished as it came. It needs to be lower over the kindling, said Lila. Con struck again and again and again until her fingers were bleeding. Suddenly, a spark caught against a blade of grass, which caught against another. Fred's heart leapt, and he dropped to his stomach and blew on it, terrified he would blow it right out. The flame faltered. No, 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 don't die, said Con. Lila added a handful of dry moss. Fred blew again. The fire seemed to breathe in and then exhaled a cough of flames. Max whooped. Lila held out a sheaf of twigs. The fire caught at them, making 5 burning fingers, and ate them whole. It belched upward. More, said Max. He was dancing in a tight circle, slapping at his own ribs. Feed it more. Fred added a handful of bone-dry leaves, and then another and another. The fire made a noise like an idea being born, a roar that sounded like hope, and sent up a column of flames. They rocked back on their ankles, grinning at one another. We could sleep in shifts, said Con, to make sure it doesn't go out. We looked at the fire with She looked at the fire with proprietorial pride. We made that by ourselves. Fred quietly put the watch in his pocket. It was scratched now and deeply dented, but out of sight he clutched it so tightly it dug a circular bruise into his palm. It's the most beautiful fire I've ever seen, said Lila. Yes, said Con, by far. Max bit lightly at Lila's arm. Can we eat now? I'm so hungry I might die. Fred scrabbled in the dust with his nails until he found a flat stone and balanced it, wobbling dangerously, on 4 green wood sticks over the centre of the flames. Lila divided the grub paste into 4 balls and spread them onto the stone. Eventually, the pancakes began to bubble. Lila poked them. They're getting harder, she said. And they smell like a shoe, said Con. That probably means they're done. One of the trees near the den had vast fleshy leaves as big as serving dishes. Fred pulled 4 of them down and dropped a grub pancake onto each one. They were hot to touch and gooey. They're probably best while they're so hot you can't taste them, said Fred. He bit off half the pancake, trying not to chew too much. It tasted disconcertingly animal. It was, he thought, like eating porridge mixed with fingernail grime. But it was better, wildly, infinitely better than nothing. Con nibbled the corner of hers. She grimaced, but she did not spit it out. To be honest, it's not that much worse than school dinners, she said, and she smiled half a smile. Max kept his food scrunched in his fist, guarding it from the others. I don't like sharing, he said. His pancake oozed from between his fingers, and he licked it off. Yuck, he said. Is there any more? The clearing was growing darker every minute. Con stood. I'm going to go and use she hesitated and coloured, the lavatory. So don't come over there or look around or I'll punch you, she paused. Please. We could decide on a place, said Fred, and dig some holes. I'm guessing you all know what a lavatory is. It's a toilet, so they need to now go and find a place to have for their toilet. Yes, said Lila, and we could stake out a path, and then nobody would get lost if they had to go in the night. They got up, all 4 of them standing close together in the gathering dark, and began looking for a suitably large tree, far enough from their fire, but not far enough away to risk getting lost. That one's big, said Fred, and this one, said Con. The trees were immense, stretching at least as high as a church. We could make that one the boys' toilet, and this one the girls', said Con. Lila's smile was sudden and enormous. It showed that one of her teeth was wonky and she had a dimple in her cheek. We could call it the lavo tree. It wasn't terribly funny, but once Fred started laughing, he couldn't stop. Con choked and had to bite her fist. Max's laughter sent a ribbon of snot flying out across the glade. They laughed loudly enough to scare the birds and to make the distant monkeys roar angrily from their night perches in the trees around them. Well, it sounds like they're starting to settle in a bit, doesn't it? I wonder what's going to happen next. The clue is in the next chapter. It is titled The Raft. And just before I continue on with the reading, you've probably noticed I'm building on my little jungle corner in my reading room, and I've got a little buddy up in the tree with me. He should have been in the first episode with us because he's actually got a little pilot's outfit on and little pilot's goggles. Okay, right, this one is called The Raft. It was Fred's idea to build a raft. He knew that it wasn't, by any stretch of the imagination, what Con would call a reasonable risk, but following the river was the only way he could think of to get home. The river moved fast, and the splash and spit and spray of it sounded like a summons from the jungle. "A raft," said Lila. "From what?" They were sitting in a clearing in the morning sun, clammy with sleep and dew. They'd slept inside the den, taking shifts to watch the fire. It had not been a good night. It had grown cold, and Max's feet, which had begun the night in their proper place, had ended up in Fred's left ear. Fred's brain had chewed up the fears he had pushed aside during the day and spat them back at him while he slept. He'd woken screaming at dawn. "We'll make it from wood," said Fred. He swept some of the dew from the grass around him and rubbed his face with it. "There's a lot of wood available." "Do you know how?" "I've read a lot of books about it," he said. "In the books, explorers cascade down rivers shouting things like tally-ho," but he assumed that was not compulsory. And Fred had read in an article on the front page of the Times newspaper about one man, Christopher McLaren, who had lived for months on a raft, eating fish and drinking river water. He made it sound easy. "Why do we need a raft?" said Con. "It would get us out of here." "To England?" she asked. "To Manus, and there would be people there who would get us home." "On a raft to Manus," said Con. Her voice was thick with disbelief. "People cross the Atlantic Ocean on rafts," said Fred. "They were adults." "Well, there's nothing to say only adults can make rafts," said Fred, exasperated. "You don't need a license to build one." "Fred's right. We should try," said Lila. "I think it's a good idea." "I knew you'd say that," said Con. "I knew you'd agree with him." But Lila looked bewildered. "Don't you want to go home? Don't you want to see your mamma?" "Of course I do," Con spat. Fred looked down at the floor. He had heard Con crying in the night, calling for help in her sleep. "But if we just wait here," said Lila, "we'll wait until we die." "People will be looking for us. We should just stay here and they'll come," said Con. Lila shook her head. "The jungle is very big and we're small." "I'm not," said Max promptly. "You're small compared to 1,000 miles of rainforest, Max." "We can send up smoke signals," said Con. "We already have some fire. Let's use it." "We'd have to burn down half the jungle to make one big enough to reach that high," said Lila. "And a fire that big would kill us instead of getting us rescued," added Fred. Con was going red. "I don't want to, all right? I really, really don't want to get on a raft and risk my life because someone else thinks it's a good idea." "It might not be a good idea," said Lila, "but it's the only one we've got." Fred's skin was beginning to ache and his stomach to clench. It always did when people argued. He stood up. "I'm going to make a raft. You don't have to help if you don't want to." The raft took more time and involved more blisters than Fred had expected, but it quieted the roar of fear behind his ribs to be doing something. "It's not going to work," said Con. Her arms were crossed so tightly across her chest that her fingers were almost touching at the back. "And we shouldn't make ourselves hungry and tired when the only food we have is grubs." Fred said nothing and went on pulling immense branches down from the trees. Most were too firmly attached to be any good, but he had found that if he put his whole weight on them and swung his legs every now and then, one would break off with a satisfying crack. He worked faster and faster, brushing away the leaves and tiny insects as they fell in his eyes. Once the wood was piled in a heap, Lila heaved one piece heaved each piece to the fire. She laid each one across the flames. When the middle burned away, they were left with two pieces of roughly equal length, each as long as she was tall. That's a pretty clever way to get the wood in half when they haven't got a saw, isn't it? They're using the fire to burn each piece in half. I'll take off the burnt bits, she said. It might as well look neat. She hacked away the burnt edges with a flint, getting steadily more covered in soot. I want to help, said Max. He strode around the clearing with his chest out, tugging liana vines down to the ground and pulling them up. I'm actually the best at helping, he said. He sat down and began to make the vines talk to one another. After a few hours, Con unwound herself from her angry ball of limbs. Silently she approached Max. She took up one of his vines and a flint and began to skin back the rough bark on the liana to expose the softer core, thick as a rope and almost as supple. She covered her face with her hair as she worked, and she refused to meet anybody's gaze. Fred watched her from the corner of his eye. Con was different when she worked. Before, she had seemed all elbows and claws, touch me not, and defensive eyebrows, but now she seemed absorbed, barely breathing as she bent over the vines. Fred had never been as proud of anything as he was of that raft. It distracted him from the pounding hunger in his stomach and head. He hauled the branches to the water's edge, dragging them, one in each hand, back and forth, beating out a path between the river and their clearing. Con held out a handful of liana vines. Here, she said, for rope, maybe. I don't know. We could dip them in water to soften them, suggested Lila. Thank you, said Fred. They'll be perfect for tying corners. Con nodded, unsmiling. Fred soaked the lianas and wound them round and round his fist until they were supple. His hands prickled with splinters, and he bit them out with his teeth. He sweated so much that his shirt turned into a sort of wearable pond. For lunch, they ate the cocoa beans raw. They were not delicious. It feels like an insult to chocolate to eat them, said Con. To try to fill their stomachs, they chewed on the white flesh that lined the pods, which tasted exactly like the eraser at the end of a pencil. And I think you all know what that tastes like. Not very nice. This isn't food, said Max. His chin and lip were quivering. You have to eat it, Max, said Lila. There's nothing else. It tastes mean. Max dug his fist into his eye. I want to go home. I know, said Fred. Me too. He decided he couldn't face any more grubs that day and set aside the last of the cocoa plant larva. He turned back to the chunk of wood he was hacking into with a jagged-edged stone. We're trying. As the sun set, Lila and Fred and Con went foraging, dragging a wailing Max behind them. Con found purple berries growing in great cascades on a tree. They're, how do we pronounce this? They're acai berries, said Lila. People eat them at home, or, she frowned, looking down at the pile, maybe you're supposed to make them into tea. Fred tried one. It tastes a bit like a blackberry, he said, if the blackberry were angry with you. But it was a relief to have something to chew. Con tried one and sighed. I miss school dinners, she said. They might be better roasted, said Lila. They were not better roasted, but they ate them anyway. Fred crouched by the fire and crammed handfuls into his mouth, trying desperately to fill the churning hole where his stomach was usually located. That night he woke in sudden and excruciating need of the lavatory. Con, watching the fire, grinned as he sprinted past. Minutes later, Lila woke with the same trouble, followed by Con and a hopping, wailing Max. It was not, all in all, an easy night. Fred waded through his dreams until morning and woke feeling like he'd been kicked in the stomach. He turned on his side, groaning, and glimpsed through a hole in the green wall of the den the pile of vines they had prepared the day before. He sat bolt upright. The raft, he thought. He should be able to finish it today. The others were asleep, sprawled on their stomachs in the warmth of the den. He scrambled out of the shelter and ran down to the river where he had stacked the wood. The sun was hot and the air was clear. Already his skin had burned a furious red, but he barely felt it as he knelt by the pile of branches. He looped each of the branches together with lianas, working a figure eight, tying them so many times over that the raft was deep green, every inch embroidered with vines. Fred worked fast, biting down on his wrist and swearing as quietly as he could when he drove a thorn into his thumb. He made 4 squares, each about 6 feet by 6 feet. Then he stacked them into 2 thicker squares and tied the 2 squares together, tugging the knots with his teeth. Yuck! He spat out a beetle that had been on the vine, then he stood back. The raft was rough-edged and stained with soot, but it was sturdy, a double thick 12 by 6 foot slab of wood. So that's approximately 1.5 metres by 3. Fred dragged it down to the very edge of the water, drops of sweat running down his nose and into his mouth. He wished wildly that he could take a photograph. He could almost see how his father would raise his eyebrows in surprise and pleasure. Reluctantly, he turned back to the clearing. And we'll leave it there for today. I hope you're enjoying my jungle and the reading of The Explorer. Okay, bye.